Most people believe fear comes from the unknown. But the truth is far more disturbing. Sometimes fear comes from what was known, documented, and quietly ignored. The first turning point emerges when an ordinary detail, something initially dismissed as background noise, suddenly refuses to stay insignificant. In each case, there is a moment where a piece of information already existed in plain sight, recorded and acknowledged, yet stripped of its meaning by familiarity or convenience. A sound on an emergency call that operators labeled as interference. A room in a house whose measurements never quite aligned with the exterior. A phone ping that placed someone where they were officially declared absent. None of these details were hidden, and none required imagination to uncover. They were logged, filed, time-stamped, and then mentally discarded because acknowledging them would have required admitting that something was deeply wrong. Fear becomes most potent not when something is unknown, but when something known contradicts the story we have chosen to accept. The human mind is skilled at smoothing over inconsistencies, especially when the alternative is unsettling. When a witness hears a voice in a supposedly empty building, the brain searches for explanations that preserve order, echoes, fatigue, faulty wiring. When a security camera captures movement where no one should be, the footage is blamed on shadows or corrupted data. These explanations are comforting not because they are accurate, but because they allow daily life to continue uninterrupted. The turning point arrives when those explanations begin to collapse under their own weight. In many of these stories, investigators initially note the detail without emphasis. It appears as a single line in a report, an annotation in the margins, a clip that is reviewed once and never revisited. At the time, it feels unimportant compared to larger, more obvious facts. But as events progress, the same detail resurfaces, unchanged, while everything else becomes uncertain. Testimonies shift, timelines blur, and memories degrade, yet that one element remains fixed. Its persistence transforms it from background noise into an accusation. What makes this moment chilling is the realization that the truth was never hidden by some elaborate force. It was concealed by indifference. Systems designed to document reality often succeed in doing exactly that, but fail at recognizing significance. A recorder captures a sound faithfully, but it cannot interpret terror. A blueprint displays an impossible space accurately, but it cannot ask how that space exists. Data points can coexist with denial indefinitely, as long as no one is willing to connect them. When the pattern begins to reveal itself, it often does so quietly. A second case surfaces with a similar detail. Then a third. Each on its own can still be dismissed, but together they form a shape that cannot be unseen. This is where fear deepens, because the implication is not that something inexplicable occurred once, but that it has occurred repeatedly, following a logic that was overlooked rather than absent. The stories shift from isolated incidents into symptoms of something larger. At this stage, the people closest to the events experience a delayed horror. They realize they were present at the edge of the truth and stepped away. The sound they ignored now plays differently in their memory. The image they glanced over now feels deliberate. Fear retroactively rewrites their past decisions, transforming moments of neutrality into moments of failure. This kind of fear does not rush in all at once. It settles slowly, as awareness replaces ignorance. Authorities and institutions often become defensive when confronted with this turning point. To acknowledge the significance of the overlooked detail would require admitting that the official narrative was incomplete or wrong. It is far easier to label connections as coincidence than to reopen cases that were already closed. As a result, the detail remains officially insignificant, even as it grows impossible to ignore privately. This disconnect between public dismissal and private dread creates a tension that fuels the rest of the story. The most unsettling aspect of this turning point is that it implicates everyone, not just those directly involved. It suggests that reality does not need to be hidden to be lost. It only needs to be seen once and forgotten. The idea that horror can coexist with normalcy, recorded accurately yet understood incorrectly, challenges the belief that danger announces itself clearly. Instead, it implies that warning signs may be preserved perfectly, waiting for someone willing to reconsider them. By the time this realization fully sets in, the story has already shifted direction. What once felt like a mystery about missing information becomes a confrontation with ignored evidence. The fear no longer stems from what might be discovered, but from what was already there, patiently waiting to be acknowledged, and from the unsettling knowledge that the same thing could be happening again, right now, documented somewhere, filed away, and quietly ignored. The second turning point unfolds when the silence surrounding these events begins to crack, not because new evidence appears, but because the people who lived through it can no longer carry it alone. At first, their stories were incomplete, cautious, shaped to fit what felt acceptable. Fear had already taught them which parts of the truth were dangerous to say out loud. They minimized details, softened timelines, laughed off moments that had once made their stomachs tighten. Silence, they learned, was safer than certainty. What most people never consider is how fear reshapes memory under pressure. Witnesses don't always lie to deceive, often they lie to survive. In the aftermath of something deeply unsettling, the mind seeks refuge in normalcy. Admitting that something was wrong, truly wrong, invites consequences, ridicule, scrutiny, blame, or worse, the possibility that the event could return. So the truth is edited. A voice becomes a noise. A presence becomes a feeling. A moment of certainty dissolves into doubt. As time passes, however, fear does not fade. It changes form. The witnesses continue living ordinary lives, but the ignored memories follow them quietly. They surface in dreams, in moments of stillness, in the way certain sounds cause an involuntary reaction. What was once suppressed begins to feel heavier than the risk of speaking. The turning point arrives when the effort to remain silent becomes more exhausting than the fear of being believed. When witnesses begin to recant, it rarely happens dramatically. There is no sudden confession or emotional breakdown. Instead, it begins with hesitation. A pause before answering a question. A correction made too late. A statement like, "That's not exactly how it happened." These small fractures signal that the original version of events was incomplete. Each revision adds clarity, but also danger, because it contradicts what was previously recorded. The atmosphere shifts when multiple witnesses begin doing this independently. Patterns emerge not just in what they say, but in what they admit they left out. The same reasons surface again and again: fear of sounding crazy, fear of professional consequences, fear of retaliation, fear of being watched. These explanations reveal that silence was not a personal failure, but a shared response to something that felt larger than any individual. What makes this turning point particularly chilling is the realization that fear itself acted as a controlling force. It didn't need to threaten directly. Its presence was implied, understood instinctively. Witnesses describe a sense of being discouraged from speaking further, even when no explicit warning was given. A look exchanged. A suggestion to move on. A subtle reminder of how unusual their account sounded. These moments taught them where the boundaries were, and they learned to stay within them. As recanted testimonies accumulate, they begin to fill gaps left by the official narrative. Details that once seemed disconnected suddenly align. One witness describes hearing movement at a certain time, another admits they were instructed not to include that same time frame in their report. Someone else recalls being asked leading questions that narrowed their answers. Each addition does more than correct the record, it exposes how the original version was shaped. Fear plays a cruel role here, because even as witnesses speak more openly, it does not release them. Many describe a lingering sense of vulnerability after recanting, as though breaking silence has made them visible again. They question whether they waited too long, whether their credibility has been permanently compromised. The act of telling the truth becomes another source of anxiety, reinforcing how effectively fear controlled them in the first place. This turning point also reframes the audience's understanding of the events. What once appeared as a lack of evidence now reveals itself as a lack of courage enforced by circumstance. The horror shifts from what happened to how thoroughly it was muted. The realization is unsettling because it suggests that reality can be altered without changing facts, simply by influencing who feels safe enough to speak. The most disturbing implication is that fear did not just silence witnesses, it shaped outcomes. Investigations followed the path of least resistance. Conclusions formed around what was said, not what was experienced. By the time the truth begins to surface, it is already out of place, incompatible with established records. This makes it easier to dismiss, even when it feels more honest than what came before. As more witnesses recant, a quiet urgency takes hold. There is a sense that these admissions are coming late, perhaps too late, but still necessary. Each corrected statement feels like a recovered fragment of reality, fragile and easily dismissed. The turning point is complete when it becomes clear that fear didn't erase the truth, it delayed it, distorted it, and buried it under compliance, and now that fear has loosened its grip, the truth emerges unevenly, altered by time but unmistakably present. The third turning point takes shape when physical evidence begins to resist the conclusions imposed upon it. Unlike testimony, objects do not hesitate, reinterpret themselves, or forget. They exist in fixed states, indifferent to narrative pressure. And yet, even these silent witnesses can be rendered powerless when their implications are inconvenient. At first, the evidence seems unremarkable, an unbroken window where forced entry was claimed, a time-stamped recording that doesn't align with the official timeline, a body positioned in a way that contradicts the stated cause of death. Each inconsistency is subtle enough to be dismissed, but together they form a contradiction that refuses to resolve. What makes this moment disturbing is that the evidence does not merely fail to support the official story, it actively undermines it. Measurements do not match descriptions. Damage patterns suggest restraint rather than struggle. Environmental factors indicate presence where absence was reported. These are not speculative interpretations but observable facts, verifiable by anyone willing to look closely. The fear arises when it becomes clear that these facts were not overlooked accidentally, but acknowledged and set aside. In many cases, the evidence was examined, catalogued, and even photographed. Its existence is not in question. What changes is how it is framed. Reports use language that softens its implications, turning contradictions into anomalies, anomalies into errors, and errors into irrelevancies. A locked door becomes likely secured after the incident. Footprints become disturbed terrain. A missing item becomes unconfirmed personal property. The evidence remains intact, but its meaning is diluted through careful phrasing. This turning point reveals how easily reality can be redirected without altering a single fact. By controlling interpretation, official conclusions can coexist with opposing evidence indefinitely. The public-facing narrative remains smooth and authoritative, while the underlying data tells a different story to anyone patient enough to compare. The tension grows when someone does exactly that and realizes the two cannot both be true. Often, it begins with a single discrepancy that refuses to be explained away. A coroner's report that lists a time of death incompatible with temperature readings. A surveillance video that shows activity after a declared endpoint. A structural layout that makes a proposed sequence of events physically impossible. These are not matters of opinion. They are constraints imposed by the physical world, and they do not bend to consensus. As these contradictions accumulate, the suggestion of suppression becomes unavoidable. Not because someone openly destroyed evidence, but because conclusions were reached first and evidence was made to conform afterward. The order matters. When outcomes are prioritized over accuracy, physical facts become obstacles rather than guides. The evidence is still there, but it is treated as a formality rather than a determinant. Those who notice this shift often describe a specific moment of unease, when they realize the investigation was never truly about discovering what happened. It was about stabilizing a version of events quickly and efficiently. Physical evidence that complicated the goal was not denied, it was neutralized through omission, reinterpretation, or quiet exclusion. The process appears procedural, even responsible, which makes it all the more difficult to challenge. This turning point deepens the horror because it reframes authority as something fallible and, at times, self-protective. The assumption that evidence leads conclusions is replaced by the realization that conclusions can lead evidence just as easily. When this happens, truth becomes negotiable, bounded not by reality but by institutional tolerance for disruption. The physical nature of the evidence makes this realization especially unsettling. These are not abstract ideas or unreliable memories. They are marks, measurements, recordings, and remnants that persist regardless of belief. To understand that such evidence can be sidelined without consequence suggests a vulnerability in the systems meant to safeguard truth. It implies that accuracy is optional when it becomes inconvenient. As word spreads, often informally, through leaked documents or unofficial reviews, the contradictions begin to circulate outside sanctioned channels. People notice patterns in how inconvenient evidence is consistently minimized. Similar phrasing appears across unrelated cases. The same types of discrepancies are explained away in the same ways. This repetition transforms suspicion into recognition. The turning point is complete when the focus shifts from what the evidence shows to why it was handled the way it was. The question is no longer whether the official conclusion is accurate, but whether it was ever intended to be. The fear here is not just about the original event, but about the realization that truth can survive intact and still be rendered powerless, documented thoroughly yet stripped of consequence, sitting quietly in files and photographs, contradicting everything it was meant to explain. The fourth turning point emerges when the boundary between separate events begins to dissolve, revealing a recurring presence that refuses to remain confined to a single place or time. At first, each case appears isolated, shaped by its own geography, circumstances, and explanations. The assumption of separation is comforting. It allows each story to be processed, categorized, and ultimately dismissed without consequence beyond its immediate context. But this comfort begins to erode when similarities surface that are too specific to be coincidental. These similarities are not broad or thematic. They are precise. A phrase spoken by different witnesses years apart, recorded in transcripts from unrelated investigations. A sound captured on multiple recordings, identical in rhythm and duration, despite originating from different environments. A behavior pattern observed across locations that share no apparent connection. These details act like fingerprints, subtle but unmistakable once recognized. The fear intensifies when it becomes clear that the same anomaly has been repeating itself, unchanged, as though it were following a set of rules. What makes this turning point especially unsettling is the delayed recognition. The connections were always there, scattered across files, databases, and memories, but never assembled into a single frame. Each case was reviewed vertically, confined within its own documentation. No one looked horizontally. When someone finally does, the shape that emerges feels deliberate, not random. The realization is not that something strange happened multiple times, but that the same thing has been happening repeatedly, unnoticed because it never announced itself as a pattern. The recurring presence does not always take a visible form. Sometimes it is a voice that appears only when no one is supposed to be present. Sometimes it is a spatial inconsistency that reappears in buildings with no shared design history. Sometimes it is a behavioral response, people reporting the same physical sensations or emotional reactions at the same stage of their experience. These repetitions suggest a continuity that transcends individual explanations, forcing a reconsideration of cause. As these connections solidify, fear shifts from uncertainty to implication. If the events are linked, then they are not accidents. They are not isolated failures or coincidences. They are expressions of something that persists, adapting just enough to avoid immediate recognition. This introduces the disturbing possibility that whatever is responsible is not bound by location, ownership, or time, and that it relies on being overlooked rather than hidden. This turning point also reframes the earlier silence and suppression. The reason details were minimized or ignored begins to feel less like negligence and more like a defense mechanism. Acknowledging a single anomaly is manageable. Acknowledging a recurring one is destabilizing. It challenges not just individual conclusions, but the foundational belief that events can be neatly separated and resolved. The system is not designed to confront continuity of this kind, especially when it defies conventional categorization. Those who recognize the pattern often struggle with how to articulate it. There is no established language for describing a presence that leaves traces rather than proof. Attempts to connect cases are met with skepticism, framed as overreach or pattern-seeking behavior. Yet the details continue to align, indifferent to disbelief. The more they are compared, the more they reinforce one another. What deepens the horror is the realization that the pattern does not require escalation. It does not grow louder or more violent to assert itself. Its consistency is its strength. By remaining subtle, it avoids triggering alarm. Each occurrence is just small enough to be rationalized, just ordinary enough to blend into the background of human error and coincidence. The pattern survives by never demanding attention all at once. As awareness spreads among a few, an uneasy question takes shape: if this presence has appeared repeatedly, how often has it gone unnoticed? How many cases were resolved without anyone realizing they were part of something larger? The implications stretch backward, turning past events into potential echoes, and forward, suggesting future repetitions. The fear here is temporal as much as it is existential. This turning point also introduces a sense of inevitability. Patterns imply continuation. If something has happened multiple times under similar conditions, it is reasonable to expect it to happen again. The events are no longer relics of the past, they are indicators. This reframing transforms curiosity into vigilance and dread. Every new report becomes suspect, every familiar anomaly a possible recurrence. The most unsettling aspect is that the pattern does not need belief to persist. It operates independently of recognition. Whether acknowledged or ignored, it continues to leave the same traces, waiting for someone to connect them. This suggests that understanding it may not offer control or prevention, only awareness. By the time this realization settles, the narrative has shifted beyond individual stories into a shared phenomenon. The recurring presence becomes the true subject, threading through time and place with quiet consistency. The fear no longer resides in what happened to specific people, but in the knowledge that the same thing has been moving through these stories all along, patient, repeatable, and already somewhere nearby. The fifth turning point arrives quietly, without new discoveries or dramatic revelations, and that is what makes it the most unsettling. By this stage, the evidence has been reviewed, witnesses have spoken, patterns have emerged, and explanations, however inadequate, have been offered. There is a sense that the story should be complete. But instead of closure, something lingers, an implication that refuses to settle into the past. The realization is not that the events were misunderstood, but that they may not be finished. This turning point is defined by absence rather than presence. There is no final answer, no definitive moment where everything stops. Instead, there is a gap, a missing confirmation that the threat has passed. Investigations end not because all questions were resolved, but because there were no acceptable next steps. Files are closed, locations are abandoned or repurposed, and the public moves on. Yet certain details resist finality. A door that remains sealed without explanation. A recording that ends abruptly, not with silence but with interruption. A case marked resolved despite no clear resolution. These are not loose ends so much as signs that the narrative was halted artificially. The fear deepens when it becomes clear that the final case does not conclude the pattern, but mirrors its beginning. The same overlooked detail appears again. The same hesitation in testimony. The same contradictions in physical evidence. The cycle repeats with subtle variation, suggesting continuity rather than coincidence. This repetition reframes the entire sequence of events, turning what seemed like a collection of past horrors into a process that is still active. What makes this moment especially disturbing is the implication of proximity. If the events are ongoing, then they are not confined to distant locations or specific time frames. They are not safely archived. The conditions that allowed them to occur still exist. The same systems, assumptions, and blind spots remain in place. The audience is no longer observing history, they are standing adjacent to something unresolved. There is often a final detail in these stories that feels deliberately understated. A new report that echoes an older one. A witness who describes something familiar but cannot place why. A location that re-enters public attention without context. These moments do not announce themselves as continuations. They require memory and comparison to recognize. The horror lies in realizing that without that recognition, the cycle would proceed unnoticed. This turning point also challenges the idea of safety through awareness. Even knowing what to look for does not guarantee prevention. The recurring presence has demonstrated adaptability. It operates within ordinary environments, relies on normal procedures, and leaves behind evidence that can be rationalized away. Understanding its pattern does not neutralize it, it only confirms that it has learned how to persist. As the narrative reaches this stage, the focus shifts inward. The question is no longer what happened, but what is happening now. The stories encourage an uncomfortable self-examination. Have similar details been dismissed elsewhere? Are there current cases marked resolved that share the same traits? The fear becomes participatory, implicating the observer not as a victim, but as a potential witness who may one day face the same choice between acknowledgement and dismissal. The absence of an ending also redefines responsibility. Without a clear conclusion, there is no authority to defer to, no official reassurance to accept. The burden of interpretation falls on those who notice the pattern. This creates a quiet tension, a sense that recognizing the truth carries its own risk. To see continuity where others see coincidence is to stand apart, exposed to doubt and isolation. The most unsettling realization of this turning point is that the events do not require escalation to continue. They do not need to grow more extreme or visible. Their effectiveness lies in repetition, in the steady reproduction of the same conditions that allowed them to exist in the first place. The story does not end because it does not need to. It simply waits. By the time this understanding takes hold, the line between past and present has blurred completely. The final case does not serve as a conclusion, but as a signal. It suggests that the story's true ending has not yet occurred, and may never occur in a way that feels definitive. The fear lingers not because something terrible happened, but because the mechanisms that allowed it to happen remain intact, active, and unnoticed, ready for the next person to encounter the same details, make the same assumptions, and quietly ignore the same warning signs.